Hey, Randy, episode 9.
Hey, good evening. I think this one should be a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Certainly interesting to some of my not only my educator friends and administrator friends, but actually a lot of parents out there that struggle with I think some of the questions we have. I'm not sure we got any answers for them, but if nothing else, we can open up a discussion.
yeah, I agree. I think last week's discussion was fun, thought provoking. I've gotten some interesting feedback on it. Episode 9, that means we're just short of being a double digit podcast. So that's
Yeah.
pretty good. Again, I think we're becoming more legitimate all the time, but I'm having fun doing this with you. I look forward to it every week just to have a discussion. And I would say the coolest feedback I've gotten that kind of has been consensus. A good friend of mine that I graduated from college with and have worked with off and on for basically my whole career. We were texting yesterday, and he said it feels like when y'all have he liked the one where we had the most debate on the revenue sharing in college football, but he said it feels like when y'all get into a disagreement and you get into the 15%, you're constantly trying to find ways to get back to the 85. And I thought, and he said, we need more of that. That's a good trait to have is how do you get back to common ground? And I think we could do a whole podcast on John Fetterman right now too. I think he's my favorite person in government because he actually, I never would have thought I'd say this, but he thinks. He's causing a lot of interesting discussions, but I think there's value in that. I think it is interesting. Once you try to break away from a tribe, though, it appears to not be loved by everybody. So it's weird.
No, that's a tough row to hoe, as we used to say. But
Yeah, you end up
yeah,
you
I've
end up
had
a little bit homeless. You don't end
yeah,
up with
you
a
really do.
he's hanging out with Republicans. Katie Britt from Alabama is one of his close allies right now, but he finds himself in a weird spot right now.
One of my old friends from back in my college days commented to me the other day. He's been following these. He says, more than anything else, he says, this seems to be awfully therapeutic for you guys. And I said, well, it is. And he said, and it's therapeutic to me just to listen to it, without people yelling and screaming. Maybe we
It's the
can continue
anti-Pierce
with that.
Morgan when Pierce Morgan has all his people and they start yelling at each other, so we try to do the opposite, but I agree with that. I think it's obviously you and I have talked about it, we have fun doing it, but that's another piece of feedback is people and, whether people agree with either of our takes or neither of them, they have appreciated how we've gone about it, so I think that's again, we're sticking to what our original intent was for you and I to have a good time doing it and maybe set the tone for how we could have some civil discussion in this country. Well, episode 9, we're gonna stick with our 3, R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, as education failed the United States, and we're gonna throw a part due on this one, so the second version of this one. I saw a podcast again or the other day that said something again, and then it happened again, so it was again. So maybe we can do a part 3 or whatever we need to. But I think we talked about it. We had a whole list of questions last week. We didn't even come close to getting through them, so we got more for this week, and we'll see how long we go on in this series. But I think we've got some more intriguing topics to go through, and think similar to our previous ones. I think you and I both have got some proposed solutions. I don't know if they're perfect. My guess is none of them are perfect. I think the one thing I've thought about a lot when with the college football stuff we did with education, um, the thing I think that's missing, in addition to the civil discussion, most of the discussions are not solution based. And I think we've done a good job, especially after the first couple, of always trying to come back and at least not just complaining about the problem, but whether our solutions are good or not, at least we start from somewhere and say, here's a potential change. And I think I listen to a lot of the discourse, whether it's political or college football, and it's only not what they said. What is your solution? Well, not what they're doing. Okay, no, what's yours? No, not what they're doing. And there's so much of that right now that it's not okay, well, here's our solution, and I think we could discuss it. It doesn't even feel like anybody's trying to arrive at a solution right now. It's just continually question everything. Everything's bad. Everything sucks, and your solution's terrible. Well, what's yours? I don't know, but yours is.
Yeah. Well, it's working off of that false assumption that if I can try to prove that you're wrong, then somehow or another that must make me right, even though I don't have anything to offer.
That's
And it
right.
becomes a matter of not finding a solution to a problem, but trying to win points and say, I won and you lost.
I was right.
Uh,
Yep. I was right.
Way
You were
too much
wrong.
of that. Yeah. Way too much of that in the world right now. And it accomplishes nothing. So, and I'm not sure we got the answers to these questions that we're still facing here, but they're at least worth raising and seeing if they even do they even have merit as serious issues, or should we just dismiss them and say, "It's not any big deal"? I don't know. Let's find out.
Let's dive in. So we're going to kick it off talking about how schools are funded, and I think we're going to focus primarily on K through 12. We may talk a little bit about college, but that's a whole different rabbit hole. And then we'll probably segue into a little bit of religion in schools and see where we go from there. But I think at the heart of a lot of this, we talked a lot about last week of what's the purpose of education? How does it need to adapt? But I think one thing, and mom and I used to always talk about this, and I heard a discussion driving home tonight about tax dollars and how tax dollars are spent. And I know my mom would, but even when she was teaching, would have been willing to pay more property taxes as a primary way K through 12 schools are funded. The issue is, and it's similar to the $5 trillion our country spends on healthcare right now to not have the best outcome necessarily in a lot of instances. I don't necessarily think it's a revenue problem in schools, just like I don't necessarily think the government has a revenue problem. It's more of a spending problem. And if you could look at it and see that the school system and the administrators were doing a lot with the money they're getting and the results were good and the behaviors are good, it might be easy to convince people to pay more to make that happen. But I'm not convinced that it's a top line problem as much as it is a cost problem. So curious just what you think in general. And then I did spend some time looking at, kind of a current statistical, how does this work right now? How are K through 12 schools funded? And then I've got some ideas on what could happen. But what are your kickoff thoughts on school funding?
Well, uh, as I mentioned last week, I served my penance on the school board for a while. The one thing that I do know, and it pretty much holds true around the country in terms of how public schools are funded. And a lot of people are unaware that about 90% of the funding does come from the state and local entities, does not come from the federal government. The majority of the federal funds that come to public schools, anyway, K 12, are for things like Title One, which is for low income areas, and then special education. And that's usually only about 10% of the funding that comes
The
in. It's
exact
primarily,
data I
like you
have
said,
is, yep, the exact data I show is 10% for very targeted things, and then 80 to 90%, if not 100 in some areas, is from, and it's split probably 50-50 on those funds between state and local, and it's all
yeah,
taxes, whether it's
you're
property
right. Property
taxes or
taxes
whatever it
get
is.
hits about 40 to 45% of it. State funding through, that will vary from state to state. If they
That's
have
fair.
a state income tax, it may come partially from that. If they have a relatively high sales tax, ad valorem tax, it may come from that. In the state of Texas, it's weird. They take a percentage of their fuel taxes. They take a percentage, if I'm not mistaken, it's not corporate sale income tax, but for licensing and that sort of thing, they take a percentage of that.
And I
And
think
then the
most of those
state
buckets,
then
whenever you put together the property tax and state income tax, because if you look at Florida, Tennessee, Texas that don't have income tax, their property taxes are higher. So that
right.
property/state income tax is where the biggest tranche of the funds from most states come. It's different proportions for different states depending on whether there exists an income tax or not. But
Now,
that's where the bulk of the funding is coming from.
right. What most states try to do, at least I know it's true in Nebraska, it's true in Texas, the part that is funded outside of property taxes, in other words, the other funding that comes from the state, from whatever kind of source, they are attempting to offset or to provide the distribution is not equal among school districts. Those who have greater needs, whether that's because they're rural, whether it's because they're in poverty areas or whatever, the states tend to provide more funding. And I've got absolutely no problem with that. You do have what I know they called it in Texas Robin Hood, which was basically taking funding that could have gone to the richer school districts and moving that over to the poorer school districts and that sort of thing. And whether we agree with it or not, quite honestly, I think that should be left up to the states. That is none of the federal government's business. In fact, as we said, I think last week, I think we maybe were both in agreement. We can just get rid of the U.S. Department of Education and all of their funding that they provide, and we'll just find other sources for that particular funding. I believe in Title One. I believe in supporting special education, but I believe it can be done through the states. Probably probably get a lot more bang for your buck in that manner as well, because they're on the ground. They know what the needs are in their local districts and in their state. And so I've got no issues with those things being funded. One of the things that we run into when it comes to property taxes, and I'm sure, well, I know it exists in Huntsville. It existed everywhere I have lived across the US, and that is the complaint that the richer school districts, because they have more property tax revenue, have far better facilities, can pay teachers more, can have more programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are those who say that that is unfair, that it's not equal educational opportunity, and that somehow or another that's got to be fixed. And I'm going to start right off and say, I don't know where you stand on that. I totally disagree with that. The reality is, richer areas, richer communities are always going to have, for the most part, they are going to have better facilities of all sorts. They're going to have nicer shopping centers. They're going to have better restaurants. They're going to have better funded sports programs for children. And they are going to probably have better facilities as it relates to education K through 12, probably be able to have more programs. The one area where I might agree to be a little bit, I wouldn't call it socialistic, but maybe the states should establish teacher salaries and maybe try to make those equal across the state based on whatever formula they put together. I don't think that there's anything constitutionally that says everyone should have access to equal facilities or even equal programs. Equal quality of education, I think we can try to provide that. And so I know some people say, well, why in the world would I want to teach in Levelland, Texas, rather than Highland Park School District in Dallas? Well, if you had sort of an equality of salary levels for teachers, that salary will go a lot farther in Levelland, Texas than it will in Dallas. And maybe I'm able to entice good teachers because there's an equality there and not have them being paid 3 times as much in Highland Park School District as they are in Levelland. I'm not sure how that would play out. My personal feeling is, and we'll get somewhere down the road, we'll get into states' rights versus federal interventions and that sort of thing. The reality is, there are those who say, well, if you took the approach you're talking about, it's the old argument since you've already got poverty in certain states that they fund education to the same level. They won't have the same concerns. You can hear the same thing about school districts. I don't buy that argument. I don't believe I don't believe the state of Mississippi is sitting out there saying, we're going to just ignore our school systems, realizing that that means that they're not going to get major corporations, people who are in high-tech industries, et cetera. They're simply not going to move to an area where you don't get quality of education. So it's not an easy thing, but there are those out there that would say that the kids who go to, I don't know, Idalou High School outside of Lubbock should have the very same kind of facilities that Spring High School down in Houston has. Well, no, and I don't buy that, and I don't buy that in terms of quality of facilities. How we carve out or ensure an equality of quality of education is where it gets a little difficult. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Or is it even possible,
Yeah,
first of all?
so right off the top, I think you and I agree, I don't like socialism. So just flat redistribution and you and I joked a little bit before we kind of went live on this. Thinking about this, I jumped back to our revenue sharing in college football. It feels like the same kind of issue of how do you take from who and give to what and all that. And I think there's some questions. So I agree with you. I don't believe that there should be equal outcomes of education. Opportunities is a different story. I don't believe facilities equal good. There's been some beautiful schools that turned out some not so smart people. I don't believe a building is what's going to necessarily teach the kids. Sure, it can help. I think really quality teachers who care about their kids and their community will turn out a lot better things than a building ever will. And I think that's part of one of the questions, a statement that goes along with what we were talking about, where you live, if local, state, and local government school boards control the funding, the majority of it, where you live highly influences education. And I think there's a conundrum. We can talk about homelessness and poverty. That's probably 6 more podcasts. Clearly, the way out of a lot of poverty is education. But education with a lot of other things is not going to get you out of poverty. So just going to dump a bunch of money into an impoverished area with education won't necessarily, it will for some kids, for sure, but it's not gonna be the sole thing that raises that whole community out of poverty. It takes a lot more than that. And I think that begs some questions, but yeah, fundamentally, I agree with you. I don't think it's a peanut butter spread. Everybody gets the same exact school building and teachers are all the same. That I don't believe, but I do, and I don't believe in the whole equity discussion. Trying to guarantee everybody an equal outcome is silly. People are born with different IQs. There's a lot of differences, and you start from a different place. I am a big fan of trying to provide as much of an equal opportunity as you can. Again, but that said, I don't believe in socialism. So I don't have a problem with people who are generating the vast majority of the tax dollars and paying that, having a little bit nicer stuff. I do think there should be a minimum standard. I think Huntsville's done a good job. I mean, you can ride all over the city of Huntsville, and for the most part, the elementary, middle school, high schools, there's a standard that they're built to, and some of the nicer high schools are the newer ones that aren't being built in some of the wealthier areas. I would also say go look at some of the test scores. It'd be interesting. Some of those schools are doing well, some are not doing it great. And again, the building didn't fix some of their issues. But I think there's a bigger thing too, is what are we funding? And I think we talked about it a little bit at the kickoff. My issue is a lot of the funding is going toward bureaucracy. And that'll get into some of the other questions we've got, but we're not funding the teachers that are really doing the thing, the Department of Education. Well, you've got a mirroring entity that exists at the state level, that exists at the county level, that exists at the city level. And there's a lot of bureaucracy, just like a lot of nonprofits that skim that money before it ever gets to the dang teachers and the curriculum. I would love, and we could probably go find, but what percentage of that is really going to teaching kids? And then I think that begs a question of what are we funding? What are these tax dollars? What are school funds funding? And I think you got to get back to our fundamental question of what's the purpose of education? And I think there needs to be a reimagining of what is the intended outcome? What does success look like in this thing? Is it test scores? And, we'll get into some of that, but what is winning? And then where should the funding go? Who should be responsible to allocate that funding? And there's a model, and I won't jump ahead yet, but should the funding follow the students? Should it be given to the school systems? There's ways to do some of that too. Should the parents have more control over the education of their kid? School choice, and again, I've got a lot of thoughts on that. But that's where, when you look at that, I'm a big fan of school choice, and whether it's vouchers, and a lot of cities have done a lot of different things where you're going to have some schools that are good and bad, and it doesn't necessarily mean you got to have more money to take your kid to that school. You've got to some way get a voucher, and you may have to stand in line, and you may have to get a lottery. There's a lot of ways to do it. New York City's done it for a long time. But if you, again, those parents who are willing to even stand in line to get a voucher, do whatever it takes to get the voucher, they have a vested interest in their kid learning, and they care, which means they're gonna shepherd that kid through the process and make sure that they do what they need to at home. And we talked a little bit about it last week of who's responsible for the education, and we got some more on this. But I think parents need to play a bigger role, not necessarily, and I agree with you from last week, not necessarily in deciding the curriculum and hiring and firing the teachers, but as far as some of the funding, where if you do have a parent who is very active and willing to participate in their child's education, the better way would be to figure out what's the best school for them to be in based on what they know. And having the ability to move around might be one of the options. And I think a hybrid model of a lot of those things could possibly fix some of it.
Let me ask you this along those lines, Carl. There, what you're really talking about is the funding following the student.
Yes.
So whatever that amount is that is currently funding that child's education, maybe at a school system that is not meeting their needs, carries with them to a better school, a school that is turning out better results. Is there a danger of school systems, school districts chasing the vouchers
Yes.
and promoting and having more money to do cooler advertising and better online promotion of how great they're doing and how their students are doing, just to go after that? And what is the danger that a school district that is doing poorly, and some of that right now may be because of unequal funding. Right now, teachers do not make the same throughout every state in every district. And is there a danger of throwing a poorly performing school district so far behind they can never catch up? Kind of
Yeah,
like the Big 12 trying to catch up with the SEC and Big 10. Can it
yeah,
happen?
I think it's definitely a problem. And I think just like in football, it's not necessarily money that fixes all that.
Right.
Because if you just take at a state level, Birmingham teachers don't make the same thing Huntsville teachers do, and Arab teachers don't make the same thing Huntsville do, and some of the smaller areas are more than some of the bigger areas. But if I look at within Huntsville, that's the one I'm most familiar with right now. Huntsville teachers do make the same throughout the city schools. Again, they're trying to normalize facilities as much as they can, and they're not all getting the same outcomes. So that's a good tell of, and part of the reason all that's happening is Huntsville is still under a dissent decree from the Justice Department that goes back for many, many years over racial lines and where schools can be built. So everything they do has to be run through this decree, and it's still in place. I think the good part of that is it has driven, as much as you can, some uniformity across the city, but you don't see uniform outcomes from school to school depending on where they are. So I think that proves what we said, whether it's college football or this, just money alone won't fix anything. And it's not going to fix the education system. And just giving everybody the same bucket of money at every single school in every single city in every single state, you're not going to have equal outcomes
Right.
because
No. Right.
money doesn't teach kids. Teachers teach kids. And by the way, the kids have to be willing to learn, have to be driven to receive that education and do something with it. And you can't normalize that. That's the piece where everybody wants that to happen. Like, oh, I want everybody to get the same education. Well, that's not reality. Everybody's born
Right.
different.
Right. Well, and if nothing else, Signetti proved to us this last year that it doesn't take money and deep pockets in your fan base to win a national championship. Now, he may get that now as a result of his success, but
They are.
there's
They
something
were
to be
pretty well
said.
funded. The
Yeah.
interesting one is Dabo because Signetti, it's a little bit of a misnomer. They were funded very well. They weren't a $40 million roster, but I bet you they were 25. And it's interesting because Josh Pate had Dabo on. And, when you go back and look, he and Saban were dominating there for a handful of years. And as money in the portal has gone, it's not only Dabo not willing to participate in the portal, he talks about they don't have the money. They don't have the alumni base that some of these schools have. So when you weren't paying everybody on the roster and maybe you were slipping them a new car or something, and it just came down to strictly acquiring talent through recruiting and everything, Dabo proved he could coach with anybody. And you can argue he's hard headed and the game's passed him by, but now all of a sudden he's not super competitive. He likes to talk about the last decade and but in the last 2 to 3 years, they haven't been great. And, again, is it the money that fixes things or not? If you gave Dabo a bunch of money, would he be successful? I don't know. It still takes people who are good leadership. I don't care if it's sports. I don't care if it's business. I don't care if it's education. You've got to have good leadership who cares about the thing that they're doing and they're very passionate about it. You got to define what success is. And then you've got to have people that are participating in the system, in this case, the students who want good outcomes. No matter, you don't have all those things in place. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at it and how cool the buildings are. You're going to end up with not great outcomes.
Yeah. Well,
And I think one thing just to, we're kind of talking about equality of funding and outcome. I think if we say, okay, set that aside for a minute, I don't think we're funding schools less than we ever have. And I think maybe the dollars aren't going as far because we're not using them as wisely because of the bureaucracy. But if we say, okay, we haven't stopped funding schools in this country, but yet whether we've regressed, which, that could be an argument that could be made that, the outcome of what's going on in K through 12 is not what it was, and forget what standardized tests say. Look at what's going on in productivity. Yes, you've still got some top performers, but look at some of the things that are going on. And then when you throw that in, okay, now let's widen the lens out and let's compare to China and Europe and other places. In India, our outcomes are not near what they are. And if you go look at dollar for dollar spent, I didn't go get the statistics, but they're not outspending us significantly in education. It comes down to that will and drive. And I heard a discussion with all the stuff that's been going on, DEI and Harvard and the Ivy League schools. This is hilarious to me that somebody even thought this was a good idea to say out loud. But they were talking about, I think it was Harvard specifically, but it was going across some of the Ivy League schools where they were suppressing Asian enrollment. And it was said that Asians had a significant advantage because their parents were
yeah,
willing to
I
live
believe
where
that
they
was
were,
Harvard. I'm pretty sure.
put every dollar they're making, working 3 jobs, whatever they're doing, into their kids' education so the Asians had a significant advantage. That is not a significant advantage. That is a culture who values education. They're putting everything into it, but that's not an advantage. And again, that's when you look at it, it's like, it's not a money thing. It's a drive and a will and a culture that education is valued, and I think that's some of what we've lost. That's a harder thing to figure out than funding. You and I could go spend 4 hours and come up with a model of how to fund all this stuff, but the inherent value of education and the value we place on it as a country, I think that's a problem, and then who's responsible?
Well, 2 quick points. Number 1, I don't care whether our scores are behind those in China. It all depends on what you're measuring. And as I mentioned last week, the one thing I don't see coming out of China that I don't see coming out of India is innovation. I see a lot of reverse engineering and copying and doing things perhaps less expensively, probably more efficiently, not necessarily more effectively. So I've heard those stats for 3 decades as an educator, and they never have meant anything to me, and they still don't. Because once again, what are you measuring? And I could find 10 points of measurement that we could emphasize here in the States, and China would be way, way behind us. Now, is it important? Is it not? I don't know. The other thing, and this is going to probably anger some of my public school teaching friends, and certainly my sister, who was a lifetime public school educator and administrator. I have absolutely no problem with the concept of the funding following the student. If the parents want to move their student to another district where they think they can be better served, I don't think the district or the state is responsible for transportation. So parents figure out a way to get them there. But I have absolutely no problem with the funding following the student. What ends up happening then if money is fleeing one particular school district and moving to surrounding districts? I'm not sure. That might
Well,
be an area where
I think
do you close the
capitalism
local school down then?
well, that's what I was
And
gonna
if
say.
so,
Capitalism may work that out and you end up losing some schools, but if you're
but you
wasting
still
money on
but
those
then you've got to figure out a way to transport those students to
that's
the
right.
nearest public school.
And maybe
But
that's
again,
the
I think
better outcome. That might be a
it may
better
be.
outcome because instead of
It
sitting
may
there
be.
pumping money and effort into a school that's not doing well, maybe it is better to say it's no different than business. Underperforming businesses don't get to stay in business.
Right,
Underperforming schools, and
right,
again, that's a whole debate of how we figure out how a school's performing,
right, right.
but there are some metrics that you can go look at that are pretty basic. I mean, basic reading, writing, and arithmetic tests can tell you, literacy tests and all if you're failing or not. If 8th graders can't read, you probably have an issue.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we've always said, those of us who did not go to Ivy League schools, and you see the Ivy League schools being the quality of their education and the quality of their student bodies being measured by the qualifications of those students as they entered those schools, their SAT scores, their ACT scores, merit scholarships, etc. I disagree with that. I say look back 15 years after each of these classes has graduated. Tell me what they're doing. Tell me what companies they're running. I don't know how many people coming out of Harvard have the kind of money that Cody Campbell has,
Yeah, it's like
and he
five
was just an
star
average
five star
average
athletes coming out.
student, yeah,
Yeah, it's no different
athlete
than
at
a
Texas
five-star
Tech
athlete
University.
coming out of junior high school or when they're juniors in high school, they get a five-star on their head. If you go look at the Super Bowl, there are very few five stars. It's mainly threes and fours. And I do think, yeah, they tout what their incoming credentials are, but I think you're right. I mean, clear and one of the things, and I've talked to several people who have friends that have gone to Harvard and stuff in recent years, and during COVID when they started doing online education, a lot of them dropped out and realized, what are we doing? But a lot of what they're paying for is the entrance into a club, and it's a
Sure,
network.
absolutely,
It's not the
absolutely.
quality of they necessarily turn out smarter people. Yes, it is biased toward their incoming scores, everything are gonna be high because, again, you're coming out of people who care a lot about school. It's just like I had a discussion with one of my friends one time. We were talking about one of the local private schools here in town was presenting data showing that every kid that went to this private school gets a scholarship to college. Yeah, because if you're willing to spend 20 something $1,000 a year for your kid to go to high school, you care a lot about your kid's education. If you take that same population and put it back out in a public school, they'd still get a scholarship. It doesn't matter. It wasn't because they went to this magic school.
Well, and yes, Harvard and Yale and Princeton, Colgate, they have the students that come in there as entering freshmen have great academic credentials. When
Yeah.
you limit, when you restrict your admissions to 3% of those who apply, and they all know that if I can get in, pretty much everything, all my costs are going to be covered. It's very easy to say, yeah, we got the top 3% academically of high school students in the United States. Well, that's because that's all I let in.
Yeah.
you know? So, now let me ask you this, because you just hit on something, regarding private schools. Now, this is a much sorer subject, and the idea, again, at the K-12 level, the idea of school vouchers, educational savings accounts, tax credit scholarships. Texas, for example, and I don't know exactly how the system works because I've not taught there, but they do have a program there which they call an educational savings account, not the same kind of thing that you and I contribute to for our kids' college education. But you can receive up to $10,000 per student of public funds for private school tuition, uniforms, and textbooks. Now, maybe that has to be matched, probably does by the parents. I don't know. But it's still public funding, tax dollars going to fund private school costs. And then you've got the typical voucher program, which some states permit to pull directly from state funds. And of course, the argument against that is fine. Now you're pulling additional funding away from the public school systems. You've got some states that offer tax credit scholarships to individuals or corporations that contribute money to provide scholarships to private schools, et cetera, which is once again, it's a backhanded public funding because there's a tax break that's associated with it. What are your feelings about that? I know the argument that I have heard for years, because this is not a new issue. It's not a resolved issue, but it's not a new issue either. Is that, well, if I am not using the public schools and their facilities and their resources, I should be able to get my funding, or at least a portion of my tax funding, back so I can help to fund my child's private school education. Now, let me tell you, this is a simple analogy, but the reason I totally disagree with that attitude is I don't go to the national parks. So I ought to get some tax dollars back, equivalent to whatever part of the federal government is funding national parks. It needs to come back to me, and I can take my family to the Maldives
You
because
can build
that's
your
where
own
I go.
backyard park. You can build your own backyard park.
Yeah. So I just don't buy into that argument. I don't use that particular aspect or that particular service that is out there funded by public funds. Therefore, I shouldn't have to pay into it.
Yeah,
So
I agree with you. I've
I've got a
told my
real problem. Go ahead, because I know
I've
you've
told
got
my
friends.
I've told my friends that send their kids to private school. To be clear on public versus private school, I think that is a super personal choice for every single
Yes,
family, and even within that
agree.
family, kid to kid. We've got some friends that some of their kids, they've got multiple kids. Some have gone to private school, some have gone to public, and they've all ended up fine. They're different kids, different personalities. I have no issue with people sending their kid to private school. And honestly, when COVID was going on, it was the closest we had come to doing something different than public school based on some of the things that were going on in public schools. Luckily, we snapped out of that insanity and we didn't do it. But I tell all my friends that send their kids to public schools all the time, no, you still pay your property taxes. You do all that because I need you to fund my kids because I'm not
Yeah,
going to. We joke about
right,
it, but
right.
similar to your parks thing. So it's funny. I always say I'm anti-socialism, and Rogan's got a good discussion about socialism, and like we're all a little bit socialist because the fire department. I knock wood haven't lit my house on fire, so I haven't had the bad fortune of using the fire department. But we all pay for the fire department, so there is part of being a responsible member of a community where you fund the municipal services, cops, firemen, a number of those things, not ambulances. They're usually for profit entities, but the firefighters and the cops are not. I feel the same way about schools. If you're going to have a functioning community, not everyone, even if they get vouchers, is going to be able to send their kid to a private school. And so if you start letting the private, that feels a little bit like the anti Robin Hood. You're sucking the
Yeah,
life out of the poor. It feels like the lottery. You're going to go take money from poor people to fund middle class kids' college education in Georgia and all these states that are doing the lottery education. But I'm not a fan of that at all. I think if you're going to send your kid to private school, you're still a member of that community, and to be able to, you mentioned it
right.
earlier when you're talking about Mississippi, to continue to recruit businesses and have families move in that are average middle class families, you've got to have a highly functioning public education system. And I think as a responsible member of a community, that's part of your dues.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And again, equal access, we've talked about, and that's something, equal access to a quality education. As far as I'm concerned, it may not be embedded in the Constitution, but it should be. We can go down the road, way down, and we can talk about, what are the things that people should be guaranteed. Uh, above and beyond what is already articulated in the Constitution. Quite honestly, I can only think of two things, and that is equal access to quality education, equal access to quality health care. Now, I haven't got the answers
We
on how
need
to
to
do it.
well, we need to do one on healthcare too. I was listening to some stuff. I've pivoted a lot on what I think about that, and I agree with you because I used to be a little less, quality healthcare and, a little more on the capitalistic side of that. The more I understand that what kind of how the United States healthcare system works and the money involved, I don't agree. So that's a whole different podcast. I think it would
Yeah,
be awesome. I really do think that would be fun, especially with your being in Ecuador now and all the medical journey you've been on. And I think that would be a fun discussion. But I tend to agree. Yeah, the ones that are articulated, free speech and right to bear arms, those are good. But I do think the access to a quality public education, if we really want to have a highly functioning society that competes on a world stage, that is kind of a
yes,
foundational piece of it. And again, it gets back to not everybody's going to end up being doctors and the same thing, but if you've got access to it, you cannot guarantee outcomes, but you can help as much as possible guarantee opportunities. And I'm a big fan of opportunity. But and that's where and I go back to I'm forever grateful to my mom for what she fought for me in little bitty New Hope High School. And we had school choice and didn't even really know it because she was able to get me to go part of the day to another school to get what she believed I needed. But that wasn't any school system or anybody doing that. That was because my mom cared about it and she advocated for me to get the education that she believed I needed. And again, I think parents have abdicated too much responsibility of their kids in a lot of facets, but education specifically. And who's responsible to ensure when your kids turn 18 that they're educated? Ultimately, it's not just the schools. It's a partnership between and I agree, I think you articulated well last week. It doesn't mean that we want parents picking textbooks and hiring teachers, but it starts with just support for one thing and supporting the schools and making sure that you're not fighting them every step of the way. And then for some people, it does being more involved and being on school boards and things, but the parents have got to step up and have more of an active participatory role in raising their kids and getting the kids educated. And I think you see the outcomes are strictly related. You can see it in Huntsville, and as some schools have moved around, it's very interesting to look at some of the outcomes, what's happened between Grissom and Huntsville. And over the last 25 or 30 years, those two schools have changed based on the new school for Grissom. It's been very intriguing to watch what's happened as they kind of rezone those. But again, parents who care deeply about their education, it doesn't matter if you're at Huntsville or Grissom or what school you're at, you can still get a good education. You see it all the time.
let me give you just a personal anecdote because I have a really good friend who is also a super liberal. She wouldn't call herself a socialist, but she probably is. Who has used the argument, has argued with me that the we've got a generational issue when it comes to parents recognizing the importance of education, advocating for their children's education, and that we've got to figure out some way to account for those children who come from poverty areas, maybe single parent homes where you've got parents that are uneducated, generationally undereducated, and that they don't understand the importance. They don't advocate for their children like someone who's in an upper middle class school district. That has never been my experience. If anything, the parents of students who are undereducated, who have lived a life that where they have barely scraped by because of their lack of education, they have been the loudest and the most insistent upon their children having access to a good education, getting a good education, finding their way out of poverty. So I
Well,
don't buy that
Andy, my
argument
story, I
from
mean,
the left that
I
that
talk a
that
lot
we need
about
to take care of these people because they don't know any better.
I
Which
talk a
is a
lot about my
typical
mom
left
and
leaning.
right. I talk a lot about my mom and she clearly was an active participant in my education. The piece I haven't ever mentioned, the person who pushed me harder and had higher expectations for my education and wanted me to keep going and doing things was my dad, who did not have a college education. He went one semester to college. He wanted me to have more opportunity than he ever had. Mom did have a college education, and yeah, she was I can't say either one of them made it super easy on me throughout school, but I always felt like dad had really high expectations and he was just insistent. He did not want me going in the military because of what my uncle went through with Vietnam. He was adamant that I was getting a college education. I don't know that that was even a discussion point for me. And that was kind of his take on it. And early on, he really wanted me to get a master's degree. And I think he realized how much it cost for me to go to school and he was ready for me to get out and get a job. um, but
Right.
he pushed me very hard. I think that's to your
Yeah.
point. With a high
Yeah.
school education,
Yeah.
my dad worked really hard and the older I got, the more I realized scraping by. And he didn't want me to be in that scenario. And he was willing to sacrifice to do that. They both were. And I think here's something I believe in general, this can apply to education or communities. If we want to look at who's responsible for what, I don't think it's the school system necessarily. It's their responsibility to go pull those kids out of those houses because I do think there is a problem. You've got drugs, you've got single parents, you've got time, you got people who just don't care, who should not have had kids. They don't even care if their kids go to school. I don't think that's a school's job to go chase those parents down and those kids and make them get in there. Here's where I believe, and I think this is again how you fix this is another podcast topic. How you can fix communities is churches. Where are churches and boys and girls clubs? What I have seen, and the coolest thing when I coached and Cassie coached rec basketball. We played in gyms all over Huntsville, every different socioeconomic group of teams you can imagine. And a couple of the guys that always impressed me, there were a couple guys at the Boys and Girls Clubs that I know one of them had worked security all night, showed up the next morning, coached soccer, coached basketball, and he didn't have any kids playing. He was doing it for the betterment of his community. And the Boys and Girls Clubs, the churches, that's who, in my opinion, if you really want to fix a lot of that, you got to have some of those nonprofits. That's a weird word, but the people that are in these communities that are responsible members of them, churches, schools, let those people do a lot of that work. And again, I think they've shirked those responsibilities too, and are not doing some of the things they should. Some churches are more focused on global missions than they are worrying about their community. I think both of those are very important. I had a discussion with somebody one time about that. I used to be very anti going outside the country with missions work and all that until a friend of mine, he said, yeah, so Carl, a lot of countries, they don't have clean drinking water for kids and they don't have any education at all. Here you have all that. And we had a discussion like, no, I think you're right. It's a both. It's not a either or discussion, but I think in the communities, you need some of these groups to continue to step up and they need, if the kids don't have people advocate, because all the kids need somebody to advocate for them. A 6-year-old's not going to go get their own education, but who is that? I think that's where, again, we could go down 16 different rabbit holes, but that's where you got the breakdown of some of the community aspect is really a
Well,
problem.
let me tell you, yeah, and you're right. This is another whole podcast, but I can tell you, being as old as I am, the churches, and I'm going to say almost across the board, certainly, and I'm going to talk about evangelical Protestant churches have abdicated that responsibility. They've turned it over to the government, which is probably why so many conservative Christian churches have now become so highly politicized and involved in politics rather than being involved in taking care of widows and orphans, feeding the poor, and those types of things. When I was growing up, a large percentage of healthcare, hospitals, etc., were funded by churches. And guess what? People could afford healthcare back then. It's a
Well,
whole
Bob and I
different
were talking about
animal.
it this morning, actually. We are just talking I was listening to a podcast on the way to work, with Gary Brecka and another young doctor who's a pretty neat guy. Think about and it's not that many years ago where the doctors and the pharmacists were respected members of communities. They lived in the community where they served and they were taken good care of. They lived in super nice houses and things were good. But, if Bill walks by and was like, "Bill, you haven't been sleeping well. You okay?" They knew who their patients were. They were members of the community in that. And again, they had nice houses they were taken care of. The sense of community, and I'm guilty of it. We all come home, shut our garage door, and don't even talk to our neighbors. That sense of the cohesiveness that keeps a community together, the role of the churches, the schools, the doctors, the attorneys, all those things. It used to be more of a community mindset. Even in larger cities, you had some of that. And that kind of breaking apart of communities and family units, I think it's led to some of this. And
Well,
education
what's happened,
is one of the fallouts.
right? What's happened is we've all become pawns in this game of how much can I return on the investment of my investors. Unfortunately, I mean, healthcare is nothing but a dollar's game. at the end of the day, I'm not saying that every healthcare professional feels that way, but they are caught up in that.
Yeah.
And
It's just a system. I don't blame any of them. We got a lot of friends who are doctors. They have been trained and they're in a system that's what they have. I mean, the general practitioners usually spend 6 minutes on average with each of their patients. It's really hard to do a lot in 6 minutes, but they didn't create that environment. It's a system that's been created. So talking about
well,
churches, that's a good segue into one of our other
I was going to say,
questions.
let's jump into this less contentious thing, which is
Yeah,
religion
religion
in
in
public
schools.
schools.
Yeah.
Go
What do you think?
ahead.
I'll kick it off. So
Okay.
I think, like many things, it's a way to divide people. It's something that further politicizes things. And I did a little bit of research on this one, and it's like, tell me the year that education was or that religion was moved from public education. Again, it's one of those things you talked about earlier with we're falling behind or not. It's something that gets thrown around a lot as a hot potato and a talking point, but I don't know that we can say there is a year that it just okay, you can't pray in schools anymore. And I think it's funny. And Alabama made a lot of news with what Roy Moore was doing for a while, because I think you got to define what is religion in schools. Well, praying in schools, being able to pray in schools, that's religion in schools. I don't know that there was ever a first period Bible class that was taught. Maybe in the one room schoolhouse that's down from mom's house, they did that back in the 30s, but in the last 50 years, that hasn't really been the case. But Roy Moore became famous for, and Alabama became famous for the giant piece of rock that he had that he was fighting for in a school system that had the Ten Commandments on it. And it was funny. I saw that, and it always felt weird to me. And I was talking to our pastor at the time, and I said, it feels like to me just the nature of what he's arguing about keeping that stupid rock in that school. He's breaking at least one, if not two or three of the commandments that are on the rock. That thing's become like a god that we're all
Hmm.
arguing about. And it's
Right.
like, if you take that rock out, kids can still pray, teachers can have conversations with kids. And I look at my own kids right now, and I look at Huntsville High School as the piece I know, but it's around Huntsville. I know it's in other schools and it's national. Young Life has been around for, I think, 55 to 60 years, still very
At least,
prominent
yes.
across many, many high school campuses. Fellowship of Christian Athletes, same thing, very prominent. So to say that religion has been taken out of schools, I don't know. And there's a court case there that I saw that kind of it helps interpret things, but Engle versus Vitale and Abington School District versus Shemp. And really and I don't really have a problem with this, is the establishment versus free exercise. The government can't establish or endorse religion in schools, which I don't necessarily have a problem with. That seems to fit the freedom of religion. But kids and even teachers and volunteers with Young Life and all they go to cafeterias and sporting events and hang out with the kids. They're still free to do religion in school. So that's always been one that's weird to me. And supposedly the downfall of all education was when we pulled religion out of schools and school shootings started and everything else happened. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I went in pretty hard on that one, so I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, I'm going to go a little bit different direction, which I know will bring me under the chastisement of, again, friends who are educators that I have. I can tell you that all the way up at Crowley Independent School District in Crowley, Texas, all the way through my senior year in high school, which would have been 1971, I was on the devotional committee. And every morning before class, right after the first bell and before class began, there was a 5-minute devotional which involved a story, scripture reading, and prayer over the intercom into the classrooms. Ten Commandments, I can vaguely recall. I can't recall them ever being pointed out or emphasized, but I can recall them being in some of my classrooms when I was growing up. And I don't see the problem even today. And I know there are those who say, well, if you're going to have a Christian prayer, then you've got to have a Muslim prayer. No, you don't. The Muslim students do not have to listen. And I'm going to catch a lot of heat, I know, for this. We teach, or we used to anyway, teach the principles of democracy and how our government operates in our schools and in our classrooms. It didn't mean we had to give equal time to communism. Uh, and or to socialism. And we didn't. And we still don't to this day. Sure, we may talk about them as political differences. There is no sense of obligation to do so other than to better educate our students about what's different between democracy and socialism, et cetera. So I think it's much ado about nothing. When I see instances or read about instances of high school football coaches being fired for having prayer with their players before or after a football game, we have lost our collective minds. And in this concept or this idea of equality for all, number one, it's not going to happen, particularly in areas of belief and faith. Now, if we are forcing students, and you say, well, we're forcing them to sit in class and listen to a devotional, they don't have to listen. Ask any teacher. A lot of students don't listen to 90% of what's said in classroom during the class teaching portion. So don't give me a break. I happen to have raised a teenage daughter. I know how quickly they can tune out anything that they choose to tune out and hear what they choose to hear. So we have made such a big deal out of this that we have sacrificed our focus on things that are a lot more important in our educational institutions.
Yeah, and I
And so
believe
I don't
honestly
know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I
well,
don't
if you
get it.
look at the left, right, and that whole discussion gets even annoying, but I think the left kind of drug it into a discussion with prayer at football games. You can't. I'm a little bit shielded from it in the Southeast because you still have prayer and football games
Right.
and some of that at some places. You don't at some, and sometimes it's just a moment of silence. But there's still an invocation at a lot of sporting events that happens, and nobody's really causing a lot of problems here. I'm sure, and I know, like you said, there's coaches being fired. I think that became a big thing. And again, love or hate this current presidential administration, one thing that I believe has happened for sure, a lot of that crap's died down. And it's the silliness over some of these things that we were arguing about and debating from 2020 until 2024. It's died down. It just has. All the discussion about men swimming with women, a lot of that people are looking at now like, yeah, that's insane. A 800th place man shouldn't be allowed to swim against women. Some of the same stuff with the prayer at football games and all that appears to have died down. But I
Well,
do
part of
think
that is
it's
because we've shifted our focus now as to whether or not we should be supporting Israel in wars in the Middle
that's
East.
we're all going to argue about something. It's whether it's prayer in schools or
That's
football
right.
games or
We just
Israel. So
shift the focus of
yeah,
the
we
argument right
haven't
now.
all started getting along. That's for sure. But
No,
no,
unfortunately, that's true.
I do think that's absolutely true. And here's what I couldn't agree with you more on. Again, I'm not a everybody gets the life's not fair. And some of these people, I love some of the protesters and some of the signs my favorite protest over the last number of years was the gays for Palestine. I'm like, man, I'd love to have a conversation. Cassie will never let me stop and talk to these protesters, but I sure would like to, just to have a civil discussion like we're doing of,
Right.
first of all, do you know where Palestine is? And then, okay, so do you know what happens to gay people there? They push them off of buildings. If you think this is oppressive, you're going to love it there. You should go check that out. But some of everything's not fair. This is the country it was founded. It is still the freest country. Liberty is my favorite thing over equality. If you have liberty and you have your God-given rights, which leads me to something you said, I believe it's one of the most important things is this nation was founded based on God, Christian principles. Like it or not, it was. And it's functioned for 250 years based on those principles. Our entire legal and justice system is based on biblical principles. If you don't like it, changing it after 250 years, you should find another country. I'm very serious about that because trying and what's happening, and unlike where I don't think, quote, pulling religion and God out of schools, I don't know that that's the problem with everything we've got. I do think having some Christian, your devotion probably wouldn't hurt just for some people to hear. It's good teachings, if nothing else, and some good examples, even if people don't want to fully follow Christ, there's some good principles in there that probably wouldn't hurt. But our form of government, and I heard some smart people talking about this a couple of years ago. One of the problems we have with government right now and how it's being run and the infringement of our liberties, our God-given liberties, is they are God-given. At the point you take God out of our form of government, we no longer have a form of government because you have to inherently believe that your rights are given by God. They're not given by man. They're only really infringed upon ever by man. And so if you take our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and, the God-given rights, they have to come from God. The problem now is there are politicians who believe they are the keepers of what rights you have, and they get to decide what rights you have and what you get to really do. That's not what the whole country falls apart at that point. Same thing, education. I mean, and again, if you don't like that, you shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't stay here. You should find a freer, more whatever enlightening country to go move to. Because at the end of the day, this nation 50 years ago in a couple months was founded based on Jesus Christ and God. Our whole justice system, the whole form of government, it pivots on that. And I think that's where what you're saying is 100% true. If you don't like that, don't listen, do whatever. And again, you're free to practice whatever religion you would like to. But our predominant faith in this nation is, it's Jesus Christ and God, and that's what it was built on.
Yeah, and let me, if I can, expound on that just a little bit. I hear people talk about us being a Christian nation. No, we're not. We are not a Christian nation, not as I understand following Christ. We were not founded as a Christian nation. Okay. We were escaping the dogmatism of the Church of England, among other things, when we came here. Not to mention taxation without representation, etc. But you are absolutely right. The principles upon which our nation was founded, the belief system that was there about human beings and how they, the rights that they have that are inherent. Those of us who do follow Christ know that God said, let us create man in our image, our being himself, his son Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. There is inherent within mankind these innate or these inherent freedoms, liberties that are a part of how we were created. And our government in its early stages sought to protect those rights. And unfortunately, we're under tremendous attack to give those rights up. Well, you're talking about more than simply trying to oppose the rights as they are uh, uh, established within the Constitution, but the rights, the freedoms that are a part of us as the creation of God. And if people want to dismiss the existence of God, you can do that. You certainly have the freedom to do so, but I will tell you where those desires, those freedoms that you feel that you should have that should be protected. I can point virtually every one of them out in scripture. Now that doesn't mean every freedom that you want, because I can show you where some of the freedoms that you're wanting, some of the rights that you're wanting are maybe in opposition or very much in opposition to scripture, suggesting or endorsing that this should be a theocracy, because then someone's got to decide what theology is going to be followed. But you're absolutely right. I think that's an inherent part of who we are as creatures, and I'm afraid we have dismissed that
And
way
even
too
to your
much in
point,
our political rhetoric.
even if you don't believe in God and you don't follow Jesus, that's fine. But this country was, again, the justice system. When you just look at the laws of the land are biblical. And
Mhm.
so
Yeah,
again, if you don't like that, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't change things over time, but there are ways to change laws. There's ways to amend the Constitution. It's a really good formula and it works. That doesn't mean you just start ignoring it, but the problem is humans and the government have usurped God. A lot of
right.
politicians believe they are God, and they have the ability to not only take away your rights, but they're the ones that are going to tell you what your inalienable rights are. No, by nature, those come from God. But that's where I do think it's causing a lot of problems in our political system, in our schools, is when you take God out of that discussion, it makes it tough because that's the centerpiece of what the thing was built on. And so I
I mean,
do think I think that's caused problems with schools and governance of schools and what punishment looks like and other things that it hasn't helped.
I'd like to sit down and have a discussion with those who have been so vehement about the presence of the Ten Commandments in a school. Okay. And I know they'll have a million different arguments. Well, that's the basis of a Judeo Christian belief. And there are a lot of beliefs that are not Judeo Christian, yada, yada, yada. Okay. And then I won't even go down that rabbit hole. I would like for people to sit with me and be totally honest. And let's put on the wall, on the board, the Ten Commandments and the Bill of Rights. And let's put them side by side. And you tell me which is more important to the survivability and the joy of humankind. If I had to pick one of the two to follow, tell me. And if you say, well, it's the Bill of Rights, explain to me why they are that Bill of Rights. Now, I can see perhaps a lot of the Bill of Rights emanating from some of the protections that would be guaranteed all of us if we would all follow the Ten Commandments. But I unfortunately, to certain people in our country, the 10 commandments has become almost evil.
Well, it's an idol, and that's what I was saying about Roy Moore, that by nature of you placing that, especially when you're talking about a stupid physical rock that it's chiseled into, you're creating an idol. You're creating a false god because you're worshiping this stupid rock at that point. You don't need it on a chiseled on a rock to do it.
Right,
And then you get
right.
into the whole
And I
different
don't know,
discussion of in the schools, is a rock with the 10 commandments on it, is that more important than Jesus? If you're really gonna take that route, talking about that rock is probably not doing what you're supposed to be doing. That's some pretty Old
but
Testament
then you
stuff.
got to remember that there are the the most elevated idols in all of our schools, and that's the trophy cases. Unfortunately, but no, I mean it's there again. There are so many things here that and again, we're just touching on. I don't know the answer in terms of religion in the schools. I think we've made it too big a deal on both sides.
But I
And why don't
think
we just
we
back
can make
off
the
and
main
educate?
thing. Well, I think that's the problem, and we've talked about it, the common theme to me that's been through the last 2 weeks is what are we trying to do? What is what is winning in education, K through 12, higher education? What is the charter? What is the purpose of those institutions? And I think the problem is whether it's how they're funded and property taxes and whether or not we can have religion in schools and go down the list of all the things that divide. It's no different than politics. When you divide, people aren't united and you can screw it up. And I think that is something that's definitely happening as you get more people to argue about it. You take your eye off what the main focus is, the quality of that thing and the outcome is going to go down. And I think the common thread among all these, the best way to fix an organization, whether it's school or, whatever it is, business, college, you first of all have got to look at it and say, what is our purpose on this planet? If you can't define that well, and what are your outcome after you go through 12 years, you do the K through 12 thing, and then you do 4 more years. At each one of those steps, and then you can break it down to elementary, middle school. What's the goal of attending that institution for that many years? What are you trying to do? Until everybody can agree on what the intended outcomes are and what the goals should be and what winning and losing is, the rest of this stuff won't fix it. You have to start with any organization defining what is success. And I don't know that we all agree. I know for sure we talked about this last week with some of the indoctrination that's happening at all levels. Unfortunately, that's when you get to the bedrock of what the problem is. I believe there are groups and there are entities who have defined for themselves what the hopeful outcome of education is. I think there's like five disparate outcomes. I think you've got an indoctrination path. I think some people legitimately do want a good education. And I think therein lies the problem of until we can agree, and that's where I like taking the federal piece out of it and the Department of Education, because I think you would have an easier time getting communities and states to agree on what education in their community or state should look like. I think a lot of the problems are coming from the higher level being injected, with their 10% funding, they think they got a big say in how this thing's going to look. But back to the community and being good, responsible members of communities. I think if you do turn it over to the states, and what you said about Mississippi, I think is true. Let the states control what their outcomes are, and I think we underestimate what local communities, states could end up doing if they were given the ability to have control. And I do think, again, maybe some of these states do need help, but maybe they reach out to some of the other successful states, and maybe it's not National Department of Education thing that's doing it.
Well, I think that's a good segue or good point to end and move it. And it looks like we're going to be at least another week into education because we haven't even gotten to higher education yet. But I think you
Uh,
make a good point. And maybe it's a starting point for us to be thinking about between now and next week. I'm in agreement with you. I think ultimately it starts with what are the community's expectations and needs. Ultimately, they will establish the end game, the purpose. From that should come how we define success at the college level. And from that, I mean, in other words, whatever the community needs, it's going to reward if it
yes.
receives it. Therefore, the colleges and universities are going to have to be preparing the coming generation of adults to meet those particular needs, which means the high schools are going to need to prepare their students for what the college's expectations are. And it flows from the top down not the bottom up. And my experience has been in education that there certainly is a disjointedness there. I've seen curriculum and forms of education and structures of high school programs created almost entirely in a vacuum. This is what we think, and so they create this structure and this curriculum, and the colleges are saying, "What the hell? This is not what we're looking for." And the colleges are doing their own thing, a lot of times being influenced by social issues being touted by certain faculty members, et cetera. And then industry out there in the community is saying, "What the hell? These people are not providing. They're not even coming to us prepared
Well, I
to
think the
meet the
problem too is
needs
when you
and address the issues."
compare Wall Street, compare Huntsville, and compare some city in Iowa that's a predominantly farming community. The three needs of those different areas, I mean, Huntsville needs a lot of things, rocket scientists and manufacturing and different things. Wall Street needs financial people that are smart in that. But training everybody on those things, you end up with a watered down version of nothing.
Right.
And I do think, again, turn it back over to the states and the local communities. And what is the charter of education? We said this last week. It really ultimately, yes, you've got some small slice that's academia for the sake of academia and research, and that's good. We need that as well to really create. It's a whole nother discussion about AI, and AIs are not ever going to be able to innovate because they only take all the knowledge they currently have. They don't have the ability yet to create new knowledge that doesn't exist, but that's where you do need research for the sake of that and academia. But the rest of it for the other folks is, what are you training for? Well, to go make a living and to be a productive member of society based on where you're going to be. And I mean, at a very elemental level, it seems like that should be the charter of education, is preparing you to go make a living doing something to provide for your family. That's ultimately, and that can be trade school, just high school. It could be quit school early and go work on a farm and make more than anybody's making. There's a lot of ways to do it, and it may mean college for some, but really, I think it's got to start with defining what is the purpose of education, and having the flexibility to make that different than from community to community. That's where you start getting into some real problems, though. The Department of Education,
Well,
I
let's
don't
take
believe that lines up at all.
as we as we prepare for next week, and let's take it, both of us, in our own way, take it from a top down perspective, see what we come up with. What is it all supposed to be about? And is there a singular model? It sounds like we're saying there's not. Okay, but there may be a singular framework
Well,
that
back
can
to
be
your liberal
applied
arts thing,
across the board.
I got a lot of mileage and thought out of your liberal arts thing, but I think that gets overlooked. I think I personally overlook it a lot. I think you brought up a great point. I did go look at St. John's College. I'd heard of it, but I went and spent some time looking at that. And I do think, because we are a federation of states, we are not 50 individual countries, although it feels like it sometimes when you go from state to state. A federation of states, and we are a nation. So I do think there is something that should bind us together that's a fabric. And maybe that's where the liberal arts piece comes in, is we've got a basic backbone of education that is more of a liberal arts focus, and then your kind of your career, your trade, whatever you're going to do is a piece that branches off of that. But maybe there is a fabric that weaves the nation together.
Well, I'll put a note on this in next week's comments. But I mentioned that Charlie Munger, who I have a great deal of admiration for, as Warren Buffett's sidekick. His work. There's a book out there that I don't believe is even in publication anymore, but it's called Charlie Munger's Lattice Work of Mental Models: How to Become a Rational Human. And it deals with this idea of the sort of the connectivity in the liberal arts and why they are critical, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that will be at least a component of what we'll talk about next week,
Good.
at least that I'll bring up. And so anyway, listen, this has been good. I don't know that we've answered anything, but we certainly have given one another some things to mull over.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of thoughtful points in there that, again, if you and I were given the platform to go fix some things, I think we could at least create some thought-provoking potential solutions that could at least lead to better outcomes.
Or at least rational dialogue that might
It's amazing
resolve
what
some of these
happens when you do
issues.
that, right?
Who knows?
It's an amazing concept.
Okay,
All
well,
right,
listen, this has been great, and we'll pick it up again next week. I look forward to it, man.
always fun. Enjoyed it. Looking
All
forward to
right, you
next week.
have a great week.
You
Okay.
too.